In the early hours of Christmas morning, 1945, in the small town of Fayetteville, West Virginia, a tragedy struck the Sodder family that would leave questions unanswered for generations. A devastating fire ripped through their home, and though it seemed at first to be a tragic accident, the details that followed would lead to one of the most haunting and perplexing mysteries in American history. 5 of the Sodder children were presumed to have died in the blaze, but no remains were ever found. Their disappearance would become the subject of speculation, conspiracy theories, and endless searches for the truth. Today, we're exploring the unsolved mystery of the Sodder children's disappearance, the strange clues and the haunting questions that still linger. The Sodder family was a well-known fixture in Fayetteville. George Sodder, the father, had come to America as a young Italian immigrant. He was a hard-working and determined man, known for his strong opinions and fierce dedication to his family. George owned a small trucking business, which he ran with considerable success, and he was respected as a member of the local community. His wife, Jennie, was a devoted mother to their 10 children, who ranged in age from early adulthood down to just a few years old. Though the Sodders were by all accounts an ordinary and well-liked family, George's outspoken political beliefs sometimes raised eyebrows. He was particularly vocal in his dislike for the Italian dictator, Benito Mussolini, and didn't hold back in criticizing the political ties between Italy and certain groups in America. In their small town, this outspokenness earned George a few enemies, but he was undeterred. On Christmas Eve of 1945, the Sodder family celebrated together before heading to bed. The mood was festive, and despite the frigid weather, the children were filled with excitement for the holiday. Around midnight, Jennie Sodder was awoken by the sound of the family's telephone ringing. She went downstairs to answer it, only to find a strange voice on the other end of the line. The woman was laughing and asking for someone Jennie didn't recognize. Disturbed by the call, Jennie hung up and went back to bed, dismissing it as a prank. But as she lay back down, she noticed something else odd. The house's lights were still on, and the curtains were not drawn. Small details, but unusual in her nightly routine. Jennie, a meticulous person, typically checked these things before going to sleep. She decided to ignore it and went back to bed. A little while later, Jennie was woken up again, this time by the unmistakable smell of smoke. She bolted out of bed and ran to wake her husband. Flames were spreading rapidly through the house. George, Jennie, and 4 of their children, Sylvia, John, Marion, and George Jr., managed to escape. The other 5 children, Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jennie Jr., and Betty, were sleeping in the upstairs bedrooms, and George frantically tried to rescue them. The staircase was already engulfed in flames, making it impossible to reach the upper floor. Panicked, George ran outside and around to the back of the house where he usually kept a ladder, thinking he could climb up to the children's windows. But when he got there, the ladder was gone. Desperation surged through him, but he tried another plan, running to his trucks, intending to drive one of them up close to the house and climb onto its roof. But to his shock, neither of the trucks would start, despite both of them working perfectly the day before. The fire department was called, but due to a shortage of staff and other difficulties, they were severely delayed. By the time the firefighters arrived, the Sodder house was already reduced to ashes. George and Jennie were devastated, and their hearts shattered as they came to terms with the apparent loss of 5 of their beloved children. Authorities searched the remains of the house and concluded that the fire had burned hot enough to cremate the bodies completely, leaving no trace. The cause of the fire was attributed to faulty wiring, and the case was at least officially closed. But George and Jennie could not accept the explanation they were given. The inconsistencies and strange details of the night plagued them, filling their minds with doubt. First and foremost, no remains of the children had been found in the ashes. Even in severe house fires, some trace of bones or other physical remains is usually found, especially for 5 individuals. To add to this, Jennie consulted a local crematorium and was told that, even at the extremely high temperatures of a cremation oven, human bones are not completely destroyed. It seemed unlikely, if not impossible, that an ordinary house fire could leave no trace of the children's bodies. As the days went by, other peculiarities came to light. George began to remember odd details leading up to the fire. A few weeks before Christmas, a stranger had come to the Sodder house looking for work, but he spent most of his time examining the house's electrical fuse box, warning George that it would cause a fire someday. Around the same time, another man, claiming to be an insurance salesman, tried to sell George a life insurance policy, which George declined. The man became angry, shouting at George that his house would go up in smoke and that his children would pay the price for his anti-Mussolini remarks. These incidents, strange at the time, took on a sinister new meaning after the fire. Jennie and George's doubts only grew stronger. Their surviving children had also noticed strange things. One of their daughters, Marion, reported seeing a strange car parked along the main road in town shortly after the fire, with people inside who seemed to be watching the Sodder children as they walked home from school. These unsettling occurrences cast a shadow of suspicion over the tragic event. Determined to find answers, George and Jennie began their own investigation. The first lead came when they found their missing ladder, discarded in a ditch near their property. They also discovered that a telephone line on their property had been cut. And then, as they delved further, eyewitnesses began coming forward with strange accounts. A woman claimed she saw the missing Sodder children watching the fire from a passing car, but her account was dismissed as unreliable. Another woman reported that she served breakfast to 5 children matching the Sodder children's descriptions at a nearby tourist stop the morning after the fire. She said the children were accompanied by 2 men and 2 women who appeared nervous and hostile. These eerie testimonies fueled George and Jennie's belief that their children had not perished in the fire, but had instead been abducted. They were driven to desperate measures, hiring private investigators and even writing to the FBI for help. The FBI initially showed interest in the case, but local authorities declined federal assistance, leaving George and Jennie to continue their search alone. The Sodders' investigation led to further strange discoveries. One day, while sifting through the ashes of their burned home, Jennie found what appeared to be a small organ, later identified as a cow's liver, placed there deliberately. It was a bizarre twist, one that only deepened the family's suspicions. But even as these strange clues emerged, the Sodders struggled to make sense of them. Their leads often ended in dead ends, and no substantial evidence was ever uncovered. Despite the lack of concrete answers, George and Jennie remained unwavering in their belief that their children were still alive. In 1950, they erected a large billboard along Route 16 with photos of the missing children and an appeal for information. The billboard, which became a haunting symbol of their relentless search, stood for nearly 4 decades, visible to anyone passing through the area. It read, "What was their fate?" and asked anyone with information to come forward. The billboard became a landmark, and people from all over the country began writing letters with possible leads and sightings of the children. Over the years, numerous people claimed to have seen the missing Sodder children, now as adults. In 1968, more than 2 decades after the fire, Jennie received a photograph in the mail. It showed a young man with a striking resemblance to one of her missing sons, Louis. On the back of the photograph was an anonymous note reading, "Louis Sodder, I love brother Frankie, I lil boys, and 90,132 or 35. The cryptic message reignited the Sodders' hopes, and they sent a private investigator to follow up on the lead, but he disappeared without a trace. The Sodder children's case became a breeding ground for conspiracy theories. Some believed that the Italian mafia had abducted the children in retaliation for George's anti-Mussolini views, possibly sending them to Italy to be raised in another family. Others speculated that the Sodder children were victims of a child trafficking ring, and some theorized that local authorities might have been involved, helping to cover up the true story behind the fire. The theories varied, and while none could be proven, they added to the mystique surrounding the case. For the rest of their lives, George and Jennie Sodder continued searching for their lost children. They traveled across the country to investigate any lead, no matter how remote. George even dug up part of his land, convinced that he would find something buried there that would explain what happened that Christmas night. Jennie wore black mourning clothes every day for the rest of her life, never letting go of the hope that her children were still alive somewhere. George passed away in 1969, still with no answers. Jennie died in 1989, still holding on to the belief that her children had somehow survived. The case of the Sodder children remains unsolved to this day, an enduring mystery that has captivated generations. The surviving Sodder children and their descendants have continued the search for answers, but the passage of time has only made the truth harder to uncover. What really happened to the Sodder children? Were they truly lost in the fire? Or was there a more sinister plot behind their disappearance? The strange clues, conflicting testimonies, and unexplained details leave room for endless speculation. The Sodder children's story has become a symbol of parental love and an undying quest for the truth. And as long as questions remain, the mystery of the Sodder children will continue to haunt the town of Fayetteville and the hearts of all those who hear their story.
Artlist.io